Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. You're watching another edition of World Talks. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guests on this next interview. Now, the United States has rolled out its most comprehensive sanctions package yet against Russia, targeting its oil and gas revenues and broader economy. These measures, introduced in President Biden's final days in office, aim to weaken Moscow's war capabilities and cement sanctions that could complicate their removal under the incoming Trump administration. Joining us today on TVP World to delve into this critical development is Tomasz Włostowski, Managing Partner at EU Strategies. Hello, sir, and welcome to TVP World.
Great to be with you, Ben.
So we've heard a lot about sanctions over the past 2 years. What makes this one different, and how does this compare to other earlier measures imposed by the United States on Russia?
Well, this one is definitely a parting shot of the Biden administration against the Russians and the Putin regime. It's like with all the previous actions that the administration has taken, it's been sort of slow rolling certain measures until the very last moment when they become inevitable. And this is exactly what is happening here. So basically, these are two parting shots from the administration. First of all, they're quite sweeping in their range. I mean, we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of companies, both from the energy sector and the defense sector and some of the other sectors as well. And on the other hand, they're also exposing a lot of sort of international financial institutions to the risk of secondary sanctions, which quite frankly is the sort of the most potent, I think, measure that the Americans have. And the third element, which makes them somewhat unique, is also they are, as you've mentioned already, they're supposed to sort of Trump-proof the measures a little bit by the Biden administration by sort of redesignating the same entities under a different executive order. Makes it extremely difficult for the incoming Trump administration to unilaterally remove them. They would need to have the consent of the Congress, and then in Congress, as you know, the majority that the Republicans have is very slim. So basically, they're very difficult to remove. So they're going to stick around for a while.
So you mentioned that the Biden administration has been slow rolling some of its measures against Russia, be it support for Ukraine or sanction packages we've seen. Is there any strategic reasoning behind it, or are they just kind of playing it safe?
Well, I mean, depends on what we're talking about. I think here with the energy sanctions, the story is extremely, extremely clear. The Biden administration, has been supportive of Ukraine, of course, and they've been quite aggressive in their use of sanctions. But it's quite clear to everybody in the energy markets and in the sanctions field that the Biden administration did not really want to curtail significantly the supply of Russian oil and Russian petroleum products to the global markets. And the main reason for that was, of course, the sort of the last elections, because the oil market is a global market. So whatever you do, it's going to have an impact somewhere, and including in the United States. So it's quite clear that the administration did not want to cause a price hike in the United States before the elections. And that's why basically all the sanctions measures were, they were rather stringent, but in the energy sector, they were quite not as stringent as they could have been. And now, of course, after the election, it doesn't really matter. So the administration can significantly beef them up, so to speak.
Right, so I think it is a very good description as a parting shot of the Biden administration. Now, when it comes to targeting Russia's oil and gas revenues, what's the significance, especially at this stage of the war? Is it still going to be impactful enough?
Well, I think it is. It's quite impactful. First of all, because they're, as we already discussed, the sanctions are there to stay. That will definitely curtail the Russian sort of revenues from the oil. And of course, they're very, very significant. So that's number one. I think it also gives Trump a certain benefit to have those sanctions in place already because, he's not the one imposing them. So it gives him sort of a carte blanche and he's dealing with Putin. He comes in with a clean slate. He can say, look, I didn't do it. The previous guy did it. But it certainly, pushes Putin and Russia into a difficult situation because, as you know very well, there's talk of some possible talks about ending the war. And so far, we don't know where the Russians stand. I think we have a pretty good indication of what the Trump administration would like to happen. We don't know how they're going to achieve it. But one of the big question marks is whether the Russians will actually engage in the talks and if they're interested in the talks. So the more stringent sanctions we've got in place, the more difficult the Russian situation is, the more likely Putin is going to entertain some talks. And then, with the previous administration and the incoming administration, it was quite clear that Americans are not going to send their forces. So how can they force the Russians and Putin into the talking table? Well, the main way to do that is through sanctions. So in a way, I think it's probably helpful to the incoming Trump administration that the sanctions were put in place and that they're hard to remove, because that also gives President Trump a certain excuse for not removing them. He says, look, I can't. There's no way for me to do it. And that definitely forces the Russians to the negotiating table, because once we do have a deal that's satisfactory to everybody, it's only then that Trump could actually go back to the Congress and start talking about removing them.
Right, so perhaps this does give Trump another card to play when it comes to negotiation table. Now, do you think that this might actually have broader impact in other nations like China, Iran, for example, countries that have significant involvement with Russia? We have seen cases before where Russia are using its ally to skirt around sanctions and indirectly benefiting them instead. Do you think that these new sanction package will also, we might see the same thing happening?
Absolutely, Ben, absolutely. And that's for two reasons. The first one is that this package already hits a number, and quite a significant number, of foreign companies and foreign ships. We've got a significant number of Chinese companies that have been hit with the sanctions. We've got, over 183 tankers. They're not European tankers, they're not American tankers. These are Russian tankers. These are tankers flagged in all these exotic destinations that we would all love to go for vacation, Belize, the Cook Islands, and so on. So that's number one. So foreign companies have gotten hit before, and they got hit in this sanctions round as well. And number two, and I think that's the very important thing, is that by redesignating the same entities that have been designated already under an executive order 13662, that also poses the threat to all the foreign financial institutions of insignificant transactions with the sanctioned entities, because they're exposed of risk of being sanctioned themselves. So once these Russian entities, have been designated under a new executive order, it makes it much more risky for all the foreign companies, all the foreign banks, all the foreign ports to, first of all, accept the shipments of Russian oil, and second of all, to get in any way financially involved in the transactions. And that, of course, has a knockdown effect on all the countries that have until today been benefiting from the price cap and the ability to purchase Russian oil, at a discount. And all of them that have been benefiting from this, oil, because we know that Russians are selling above the price cap as well, and somebody's buying it. We know India's buying it. We know China's buying it. Well, with these secondary sanctions in place and the threat of them, that makes it much more complicated for all these entities and all these countries to benefit.
Right, but do you think that's going to have a huge impact on the global market? Will we be seeing higher energy prices, or perhaps Trump's new strategy of drill, baby, drill might alleviate some of that?
Well, there are two questions there. One is, I think, number one is, let's go back to the Trump administration for a second. We have the Russian sanctions, that's one. But we also know that the Trump administration is looking at Iran as well. So this is not a Russian topic. It's a more broad topic of the incoming Trump administration. The Russians are already subject to significant sanctions. Iran is probably in the crosshairs of the incoming Trump administration as well. So I think the pressure on the oil market is going to be actually quite significant.
And speaking of the incoming Trump administration, I'm also wondering how's his foreign policy approach going to affect the implementation of these sanctions? We do know that, like you mentioned, there's a few Trump-proofing measures involved, but is it in his incentive in the first place to even scrap these sanctions?
Well, as we discussed, so some of number one is I think, first of all, we have to be very clear. We don't know what the Trump administration's objectives are and what their plan is. So we have to be clear about that. He's talked about ending the war, but we don't know how he's going to go about it. And there are significant, I think, indications that actually increasing pressure on Russia is one of the pathways to getting to a deal. So, we don't know if he will actually try to remove the sanctions. And as we've already discussed, the Biden administration's steps of redesignating the entities under a different executive order they take the topic off Trump's hands. So that's number one. Second of all, I think also, the fact that a lot of these entities and these sanctions are in place, they send a really powerful message to the world. I am a sanctions practitioner myself. I've been involved in this for over 10 years. And I can tell you that even in Europe, where American sanctions in theory don't apply, they do apply. Everybody knows which entities are sanctioned, and American sanctions play a sort of a massive role in the way that the global commerce functions. So in a way, what I'm getting at is that the fact that all these companies have been listed, and the number of them is so big, and there's a threat of secondary sanctions, I think that's already scares companies globally into getting into transactions with the listed entities. So in effect, I think the fact that Biden imposed those sanctions, that's already sort of a measure in itself.
All right. Well, do you think we might still see a situation in which these Russian energy is being sold to various different countries in a just more roundabout way, instead of just direct purchasing or from like a secondary source? They put these tankers, sail it across the world, sell it to each other, and eventually basically was able to evade some of the sanctions. Do you think that this package will be robust enough to at least put a significant enough hindrance to that?
Look, absolutely, Ben, absolutely. I mean, the trade is going to continue. I mean, it's very difficult to completely kill it. However, even if the trade continues, one of the big impacts of the sanctions, it really drives up the cost of those transactions for the Russians. Now they have to devise another way to get the oil to the global markets. They have to find new ships. They have to set up new parties. They have to find ways of financing the transactions. And the transactional costs on the Russian side keep going up and up and up and up, which means that when they finally make the sale, it's just much less profitable. So, even if the trade continues, the revenues that the Russians will derive from that trade will still be lesser, again, because the prices stay more or less the same. Maybe they will go up a little bit, but they're not going to increase significantly. But the transactional costs keep going up. And the Russians now, instead of fighting the war in Ukraine, now they're going to be figuring out how to get the oil to the global markets. They have to allocate the resources, the manpower, and so on to create all those networks. And while they're doing that, they're not applying the same resources, the same time, and the same people to devising how to beat the Ukrainians, which is exactly what we want. We don't want them focused on the Ukrainians. We want them focused on the sanctions and how to circumvent them.
Right, and last but not least, going back to the potential peace negotiation, do you think that this might ultimately contribute to them reaching an agreement?
Well, the sanctions definitely will, I think. I mean, as we've already discussed, they strengthen President Trump's hand. Number one, by being in place, and I think most importantly, by him not being involved in them, because that gives them sort of a clean slate with President Putin. He can say, look, I didn't do it, the other guy did it, I can't remove them, so they're in place. And while we're talking, the sanctions are having their effect. They're limiting the Russian resources, they're limiting the revenues, and possibly increasing the likelihood of the Russians being forced to the negotiating table and finding some meaningful resolution.
Right. Thank you so much for your input and insight and help us unpack this situation. Really appreciate it. And thanks for being with us on TVP World.
Thank you, Ben.
Cheers. And thank you for watching this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.